Hi, my name is Rebecca Ferguson, and this is the final video for my final infographic for the Info 424 class. And today I'm going to be talking about the process I went through in creating my final infographic, which you can see in front of you right here. The topic was coffee in Seattle, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the design principles at play and how I arrived at this infographic by using different layout models, a base model, and a color model, and as well as a typography model. And so before we get started, I'm just going to briefly show you guys the models that I used, and then we'll go back to reference them as I start to talk about them in reference to my infographic. So over here you can see this was my color model, and it was also my base model. Right here we have the typography model. And then right here we have the layout model. So going back to my final infographic, the first thing I want to cover is the different visual potential elements in the infographic. And so throughout the course of the quarter, we created different visual displays and then combined them all into one final infographic. So for my first type, I have number potential, and I've used a number potential in this display right here where I show the coffee shops per 100,000 people in each city, and I have the numbers for Seattle here, and so each little coffee cup equals one coffee shop, and then I compare it to a different city on the West Coast, Los Angeles, as a reference point. The display right next to it, the coffee shops with top-ranked espresso, is also somewhat of a number display, because each of these little circles are different coffee shops, and they actually have number ratings inside of them. And so that is my number potential displays. Next we have location potential. So there's also two of these. So this one right here is obviously also location based by showing you the map of where these coffee shops in Seattle are located. And then over here we have a display showing who Googles coffee the most, as in what area of the Puget Sound Googles coffee the most, and it actually goes through the different areas of Puget Sound. So Seattle right here has the largest circle, and this information is pulled from Google search rankings, and it's encoded to the amount of times that people in the Seattle area are actually searching for coffee or terms related to coffee on Google. Then we have the appearance display, and that is this display right here. And this is just kind of showing the, primarily extra shots of espresso in coffee as well as extra dark roast. But this data actually came from some studies that Starbucks did that analyzed the most common orders in their different locations, and it was found that people in Seattle preferred the extra shots and the extra dark roast. But the main purpose of this display is to kind of just have some nice visual elements in relation to coffee. And next, finally, we have time potential, which is right over here. And this is telling you when the best times to drink coffee are. And you can kind of see the times labeled around the parts of the clock. But basically, there are certain times when your cortisol levels spike and you are naturally more energized, and there are certain times when your cortisol levels decline, and those are the times that you should actually be drinking coffee because it maximizes the boost that you get from the caffeine. So you can see here that from 9:30 to 11:30 is coffee time, as well as 1:30 to 5. And then finally we have our relationship display, and that is down here at the bottom with the title From Plant to Cup. So this display is telling you how coffee actually gets to sit in front of you. And, first, of course, they grow the coffee seeds, they harvest them, they process the cherries, roast, grind, and finally you brew your coffee however you like. So that's kind of the different visual elements of my infographic. Moving on, we're going to start to talk a little about the encodings that are used and why we used them. So this is probably one limitation of my infographic is when I was making these displays, I made them all separately and didn't put a ton of forethought into how they were going to play into each other, so they all kind of have different types of encodings happening in them. For example, over here we have size encoding with the size of the circles. And these circles are actually also size encoded, but you notice that the colors are different, and it might have created a little bit, more unity if we'd used the same color for the size encodings, as well as the same styling. Over here we have, some opacity happening in the circles, and we don't have that over here. We also had some color encoding over here with the coffee time being blue and cortisol being the orange color, and the font tying those together, or the font colors tying to the colors on the actual clock. Over here we have essentially number encoding with the coffee shops, or representing the coffee cup icon representing one coffee shop. And in this case it's a one-to-one representation, but it could have, in other infographics, one coffee cup icon could have represented 5 coffee shops, and that would be a different kind of encoding. But since it is still representing something else, it's just a one-to-one encoding. The only thing that I would say is the reason that I went one-to-one was because it really showed off the stark difference and contrast in the amount of coffee shops Seattle has in comparison to Los Angeles. But using a 1-to-5 or something like that might have been more striking visually. But in this case, I wanted to represent the data accurately, and so that's why I chose the one-to-one representation. A couple other encodings that I could have potentially used to make the display better. I would say that down here in the relationship display, kind of showing the process a little bit better, maybe potentially encoding, the size of the arrows to how long each step takes, could have added an extra element to the display. Moving on from encodings, we're going to talk about color. So just for reference, my color model was this one right here, and I really tried to match the color model as closely as possible, and I took a lot of elements from it. So for example, this title bar, I kept that same brown over on my display right here. I also noticed that a lot of the icons, were flat icons, and they had, just the brown or maybe the blue in them. In an earlier version of my display, I had actually colored a couple of these to more accurately represent them. So for example, this had red cherries on it, but in looking at my color display, none of them were, that quote accurately depicting any of the elements, so I decided to keep them all the flat brown, which looks nice, but looking back, maybe putting them into a different color would have highlighted them a little bit more in this actual display, since a lot of the text, particularly the descriptive text, is brown, and so it doesn't really draw attention to them. So we have, those are kind of the colors that are happening here. We also have, this teal color and this orange color, and I took those from right here. I really liked the look of this, and I kind of wanted to emulate that on a portion of my model, so I have the teal title bar and the orange background. And then this map, you have that teal color for the water, and this just the tan color for the land, and that's coming from this map right here as well. And then again, all of the titles are that brown color, and they're kind of describing, they're actually not titles, but they describe each of the little different infographic elements, and then most of the titles are in that teal color. So that's what I have happening on these displays. Primarily, I use color to encode and to highlight, and a couple times to trigger associations. So, the coffee beans I chose as the brown color because obviously coffee beans are brown, as well as the espresso shots. But I kind of tried to, use them to highlight. So over here I have the orange kind of drawing attention to the locations on the map. And then same thing over here, using to highlight the orange and the blue. That's kind of where your eye is drawn when you look at the display. And that was the purpose. And I would say that I could have done a little bit better job on using color to highlight, particularly like right in here. This light blue kind of blends into the background a little bit, and I could have done a better job on maybe selecting some more looking at all my displays together and tying all the colors together to use the same, the orange always to highlight, like for example using the orange here to highlight. Okay, moving on from color, I'm going to talk a little bit about the text in my infographic. So right over here we can see my text model. Let's zoom in on it a little bit, and you'll notice that all of the text here is actually in caps, and as well they use the same font throughout the entire infographic. So on these little kind of subheadings, as well as this title bar up here, and even this descriptive text is all the same font. And so I wasn't able to match the font exactly, but I found a font, a sans serif with the pointy style A. And so that is what I used in my infographic. It was actually Futura, that's the font that I'm using here. And I kind of tried to follow some of the same guidelines that they were using, so you notice my title is in caps, as well as these are all in caps. And then these descriptive elements above each display is also in caps. Originally I didn't have them in caps, and then looking at my typography model I noticed that a lot of, their subheadings were in caps, but also my base model has these all in caps as well, and it kind of helps contribute to the blocky layout of the display. It also makes them a little bit easier to read since they are so small. And finally, so I'm using labels, I'm also using annotations here and describing the infographics. And the type styles, these are all just regular, just medium, not bold or italicized or anything like that, except for right here. I used a bold typeface for the font. That's actually the only location that I did that, and looking back, that maybe kind of stands out a little bit since it's not used anywhere else, so I either should have kept it similar to the rest of my infographic, or maybe used that bold font in some other locations on some other displays to kind of really tie it in. So potentially as under these, these kind of sub-labels under the actual images or down here, it could have worked nicely, or even on this display to kind of make these numbers stand out a little bit better. So that was a little out of place, but when I was designing this display on its own, I really liked the way that it looked bolded, so that was why that was where that came from. Let's see, moving right along, some of the visual hierarchy that I kind of attempted to create in my display. I really wanted to kind of draw attention with the title bar, and then in one of my critiques somebody kind of mentioned that I didn't have this icon over here, and so their eye just kind of trailed off after they read the title bar, and so I kind of added this little coffee cup icon as kind of like an endpoint on that element, and you'll notice that they do something similar over here on this display. After, looking at the title, I kind of wanted all of these to kind of, your eye to kind of travel over them sort of together, so to kind of blend a little bit together, but you start here and kind of work your way down and up and around and then over to here, which then takes you to the bottom of the display for this relationship diagram. And one thing is that this, being its own separate orange background with the blue title bar, it really pops. And the same thing happens over here, but over here it's in like the bottom right corner, and it kind of, is the end of that infographic. You look like this up and down, and then you end right here. So it kind of has a similar effect here in terms of, ending this middle section, but it's not really an end on the whole infographic. And so the visual hierarchy, that's kind of the flow and how it leads you through the infographic, and like I said, it's kind of created by the spacing of the elements as well as the sizes. So, the big title bar, and then even kind of extending this title, I made sure to extend it past the rest of this content, and I wanted to leave a margin around the main body content, and so that's kind of how hierarchy is created there. And then that margin, really makes this the meat of the infographic, and then these underlines on these title bars I think really help to kind of create some hierarchy within the elements in this middle section, and also as well, this title bar with with the blue or the teal box beneath the title for this relation or location display as well kind of helps create hierarchy just within these elements. And the last thing I would say, I think that these text descriptions being in all caps kind of helps as well with the visual hierarchy and defining the separate elements, but also unifying them as one. Alright, so in terms of unity and variety, this was kind of something that I struggled with when I was putting my infographic together. I had all these different displays, and they weren't all sized correctly, and they kind of looked like they went together, but then they also kind of didn't. And so that is something that I struggled with, and I think a couple things that help create unity, as I sort of mentioned before, is the use of the common description and title stylings. So keeping these in all caps, having the line segment and the description above them is something that helps create unity, as well as using the same fonts for all of these. One element that I didn't actually update. This is one of the first displays that I created, and I didn't really think about or realize the fact that this is not in all caps, which is definitely a departure from the rest of this infographic and something that should be improved if I go back to edit this. Putting this in all caps, making sure that that title size is similar to all of these ones, and maybe even playing with the background behind that title as well, the box, to make it fit in a little bit better, make it more unified with the rest of the display. In terms of variety, I kind of have, the actual visual elements of all the infographics, I think is where the variety comes from. So we have different icons happening. We have, this clock over here, which is, very different from the fact that we have all these repetitive coffee icons over in this display, as well as down here, the steps, the whole process, each having different icons, kind of lends some variety. And the other place that I think variety comes from is from the different sizes of the displays. Having just, I feel like if I take out this bottom element, if I just had 3 columns of content, it would be a little bit almost too blocky. But I like that I break up, these 3 columns in this main display with an element that spans the whole bottom of the display. I think that helps kind of make it a little, add some more variety into the actual display altogether. In terms of layout, I took this from my layout model, which I will show you again is right here. And kind of what I did is I kept this title bar at the top, and then they have this second section right here, and then within that section they have 1, 2, 3 columns, and then they have this kind of bottom section that spans the whole bottom of the infographic. And so that's what I did when I was creating my layout, is I have my title bar at the top, I have this middle section with 3 kind of columns happening, and then I have this element at the bottom that spans the whole bottom of the infographic. And so I really tried to kind of take that layout in terms of their the positions of their displays and apply it to my base model. And so from my base model, I kept the same styling essentially, with the title bar, with the different colored backgrounds, with all of that stuff. And so one thing that was noted to me when I was kind of creating this display was that it was really important to make sure that each element was spaced out, or that each display had spacing between it and the display next to it, because if, for example, this display was too close to this display, people weren't sure if this title was describing the display above it or the display below it. And that kind of comes from the fact that people aren't used to seeing descriptions above displays, they're usually underneath them. And so I made sure to separate each display by spacing it out and making sure there was enough padding in between displays that were next to each other. So when I was editing my final layout, that's kind of what I worked on, was spacing out the displays to make sure that they were separated. But then they're also kind of grouped together by all, starting on the same spot and being aligned on the same spot. So, these elements align right here, and these elements align right here, and then these lines align horizontally as well. And This is pretty similar to my layout model, as we kind of went over before. My layout model doesn't have quite the same amount of spacing in between the elements, but they have lines in between elements, both vertically, which kind of helps to distinguish them. So that is one difference between my final infographic and my layout model. And finally, alignment. We kind of talked about that a little bit, but I have, the displays aligned on the left and right sides, and then as well as horizontally. And then I have my title bar, which spans, the whole display, and then my main content aligned within that in this little box right here. So this comes down and aligns here, as well as over on this side. And so that is my final infographic in a nutshell. I would say that I am fairly pleased with how it turned out. There are definitely some improvements to be made, but overall I learned a lot in creating this, and I learned a lot about how different elements interact with each other and how important it is, I think, to kind of create common themes of unity to make the final version really come together. And so I would say that that is something that I worked on a lot, but could probably still improve within the final infographic as well. And thank you so much for listening.